Chapter 7 Operant discrimination. Discriminative stimuli. Operant conditioning may be described without mentioning any stimulus which acts before the response is made. In reinforcing neck stretching in the pigeon, it was necessary to wait for the stretching to occur. We did not elicit it. When a baby puts his hand to his mouth, the movement may be reinforced by the contact of the hand and mouth. But we cannot find any stimulus which elicits the movement and which is present every time it occurs. Stimuli are always acting upon an organism, but their functional connection with operant behavior is not like that in the reflex. Operant behavior, in short, is emitted rather than elicited. It must have this property if the notion of probability of response is to make sense. Most operant behavior, however, acquires important connections with the surrounding world. We may show how it does so in our pigeon experiment by reinforcing neck stretching when a signal light is on, and allowing it to be extinguished when the light is off. Eventually, stretching occurs only when the light is on. We can then demonstrate a stimulus-response connection which is roughly comparable to a conditioned or unconditioned reflex. The appearance of light will be quickly followed by an upward movement of the head, but the relation is fundamentally quite different. It has a different history. It has a different history and different current properties. We describe contingency by saying that a stimulus, the light, is the occasion upon which a response, stretching the neck, is followed by reinforcement with food. We must specify all three terms. The effect upon the pigeon is that eventually the response is more likely to occur when the light is on. The process through which this comes about is called discrimination. Its importance in a theoretical analysis, as well as in the practical control of behavior, is obvious. When a discrimination has been established, we may alter the probability of a response instantly by presenting or removing the discriminative stimulus. Operant behavior almost necessarily comes under this kind of stimulus control. Since only a few responses are automatically reinforced by the organism's own body without respect to external circumstances, reinforcement achieved by adjusting to a given environment almost always requires the sort of physical contact which we call stimulation. The environmental control has an obvious biological significance. If all behavior were equally likely to occur on all occasions, the result would be chaotic. It is obviously advantageous that a response occur only when it is likely to be reinforced. This is in reference to evolutionary principles, if people are wondering. The three-term contingencies which produce discriminative operants are of many kinds. We develop the behavior with which we adjust this to the spatial world because visual stimulation from an object is the occasion upon which certain responses of walking, reaching, and so on lead to particular tactual consequences. The visual field is the occasion for effective manipulatory action. The contingencies responsible for the behavior are generated by the relations between visual and tactile stimulation, characteristic of physical objects. Other connections between the properties of objects supply other sorts of contingencies, which led to similar changes in behavior. For example, in an orchard, in which red apples are sweet and all others sour, the behavior of picking and eating comes to be controlled by the redness of the stimulus. The social environment contains vast numbers of such contingencies. A smile is an occasion upon which social approach will meet with approval. A frown is an occasion upon which the same approach will not meet with approval. Insofar as this is generally true, approach comes to depend to some extent upon the facial expression of the person approached. We use this fact when, by smiling or frowning, we control to some extent the behavior of those approaching us. The ringing of a telephone is an occasion upon which answering will be followed by hearing a voice. The young child may pick up and speak to the telephone at any time, but eventually will do so only when it has been ringing. The verbal stimulus, come to dinner, is on occasion, upon which going to the table and sitting down is usually reinforced with food. The stimulus comes to be effective in increasing the probability of that behavior and is produced by the speaker because it does so. Bells, whistles, and traffic signals are other obvious occasions upon which certain actions are generally followed by certain consequences. Verbal behavior fits the pattern of the three-term contingency and supplies many illuminating examples. We learn to name objects by acquiring an enormous repertoire of responses, each of which is appropriate to a given occasion. A chair is the occasion upon which the response chair is likely to be reinforced. A cat is the occasion upon which a response cat is likely to be reinforced, and so on. When we read aloud, we respond to a series of visual stimuli with a series of corresponding vocal responses. The three-term contingency is evident in teaching a child to read. A given response is reinforced with the right or wrong according to the presence or absence of appropriate visual stimulus. Many verbal responses are under the control of verbal discrimination stimuli. In memorizing the multiplication table, for example, the stimulus 9 by 9 is the occasion upon which the response 81 is appropriately reinforced, either by an instructor or by the successful outcome of a calculation. Historical facts and many other types of information fit the same formula. When the student writes an examination, he admits insofar as it has become part of his repertoire the behavior which is reinforced upon the special occasion established by the examination question. We use operant discrimination in two ways. In the first place, stimuli which have already become discriminative are manipulated in order to change probabilities. We do this explicitly and almost continuously when we direct constructive work, control the behavior of children, issue orders, and so on. We do it more subtly when we arrange stimuli whose effectiveness has not been specifically established for such purposes. In displaying merchandise in a large store, the behavior of the customer is controlled through existing discriminative operants. The purchase of certain types of merchandise may be assumed to be strongly determined by conditions which commonly bring customers to the store. It is a mistake to exhibit this merchandise in the front of the store, since the customer will then buy and leave. Instead, goods are displayed which are more likely to be purchased on the spur of the moment, rather than as the result of deprivation sufficient to bring the customer into the store. The display serves as a reminder in the sense of making the occasion optimal for the omission of a weak behavior. In the second place, we may set up a discrimination in order to make sure that a future stimulus will have a given effect when it appears. Education is largely a matter of establishing such discriminative repertoires. As we shall see in chapter 26, we set up contingencies which generate behavior, and as a result of which children will look before crossing streets. We'll say thank you upon the proper occasions. We will give correct answers to questions about historical events. We'll operate machines in the proper manner. We'll buy books, attend concerts, play, and moving pictures identified in certain ways, and so on. Voluntary versus involuntary behavior. The relation between the discriminative operant and its controlling stimulus is very different from elicitation. Stimulus and response occur in the same order as in the reflex, but this does not warrant the inclusion of both types in a single stimulus-response formula. The discriminative stimulus does not elicit a response, it simply alters the probability of occurrence. The relation is flexible and continuously graded. The response follows the stimulus in a more leisurely fashion, and it may be intense or feeble, almost without respect to the intensity of the stimulus. This difference is at the root of the classical distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior. In the early history of the reflex, an effort was made to distinguish between reflexes and the rest of the behavior of the organism. One difference frequently urged was that a reflex was innate, but the principle of conditioning made such a distinction trivial. It was almost said that reflexes are different because they were unconscious. This did not mean that the individual could not report upon his own reflex behavior, but that the behavior made its appearance whether he could do so or not. Reflex action might take place when a man was asleep or otherwise unconscious. As we shall see in the chapter 17, this too is no longer considered a valid difference. Behavior which is clearly not reflex may occur under such circumstances. A third classical distinction held that reflexes were not only innate and unconscious but involuntary. They were not willed. The evidence was not so much that they could not be willed as they could not be willed against. A certain part of the behavior of the organism cannot, so to speak, be helped. We may not be able to keep from winking when something moves close to our eyes. We may not be able to help flinching at gunfire or salivating at the taste of a lemon or at the sight of a lemon. Before the discovery of the reflex, such behavior was reconciled with a scheme of inner causation by postulating separate causes. It was attributed to seditious selves or foreign spirits temporarily invading the body. The involuntary sneeze, for example, revealed the presence of the devil. We still take the precaution of saying God bless you when someone sneezes. With the advent of the notion of the reflex, the issue of controllability became less crucial. In the present analysis, we cannot distinguish between involuntary and voluntary behavior by raising the issue of who is in control. It does not matter whether behavior is due to a willing individual or a psychic usurper if we dismiss all inner agents of whatever sort. Nor can we make the distinction on the basis of control or lack of control, since we assume that no behavior is free if we have no reason to distinguish between being able to do something and doing it. Such expressions as not being able to do something or not being able to help doing something must be interpreted in some other way. When all relevant variables have been arranged, an organism will and will not respond. If it does not, it cannot. If it cannot, it will not. To ask whether someone can turn a handspring is merely to ask whether there are circumstances under which he will do so. A man who can avoid flinching at gunfire is a man who will not flinch under certain circumstances. A man who can hold still while at a dentist works on his teeth is one who holds still upon certain occasions. A matter of the kind of control it corresponds to the distinction between elicited and discriminative stimuli. The eliciting stimulus appears to be more coercive. Its causal connection with behavior is discovered first. The discriminative stimulus, on the other hand, shares its control with other variables, so that the inevitability of its effect cannot be easily demonstrated. But when all relevant variables have been taken into account, it is not difficult to guarantee the result, to force the discriminative operant as inexorably as the eliciting stimulus forces its response. If the manner in which this is done and the quantitative properties of the resulting relation warrant such a distinction, we may say that voluntary behavior is operant and involuntary behavior a reflex. It is natural that we will as an inner explanation of behavior should have survived longer in the study of operant behavior, where the control exercised by the environment is more subtle and indirect. In the case of the operation we call reinforcement, for example, the current strength of a behavior is due to events which have occurred in the past history of the organism. Events which are not observed at the moment, their effect is felt. Deprivation is a relevant variable, but one which has a history of which we may have little or no information. When a discriminative stimulus has an effect upon the probability of a response, we see that the present environment is indeed relevant. But it is not easy to prove the inevitability of control without an adequate account of the history of reinforcement and deprivation. Consider, for example, a hungry guest who hears his host say, "Won't you come to dinner?" We assume that this guest has undergone the elaborate conditioning responsible for behavior described as knowing English. As a result of responsive conditioning, this verbal stimulus leads to a certain amount of involuntary secretion of saliva and other gastric juices, and perhaps contraction of the smooth muscles in the walls of the stomach and intestines. Graphic. It may also induce the guest to approach and sit down at the table, but this behavior is certainly of another sort. It means to be less sharply determined, and we predict it less confidently. Both the salivary reflex and the operant response occur because they have usually been reinforced with food. But this history lies in the past, much of it in the remote past. In the absence of an appropriate state of deprivation, they may not occur. The guest may instead reply, "Thank you, I'm not hungry." But even if the history of reinforcement and deprivation is satisfactory, the operant responses may be displaced by other behavior involving the same musculature. If our guest has been offended by undue delay in the preparation of the meal, for example, he may take revenge by creating a further delay, perhaps by asking to wash his hands and remaining out of the room for a long time. The behavior has been acquired because it has been reinforced by its damaging effect upon other persons, because the guest has learned how to annoy people. Before we can predict that he will come to the table, as surely as we predict that he will salivate, we must have information about all relevant variables, not only those which increase the probability of the response, but also those which increase the probability of competing responses. Since we ordinarily lack anything like adequate knowledge of all these variables, it is simpler to assume that the behavior is determined by the guest's will, that he will come if he wants to and wills to do so. But the assumption is of neither theoretical nor practical value, for we still have to predict the behavior of the will. The inner explanation is no shortcut to the information we need. If many variables are important, many variables must be studied. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior or operant behavior and reflex behavior parallels another distinction. Reflexes are primarily concerned, as we have seen, with the internal economy of the organism, where glands and smooth muscles are the most important reflexes. Employing the striped muscles are are most important. Reflexes employing the stripe muscles are chiefly involved in maintaining posture and other responses to more stable properties of the surrounding world. This is the only area in which well-defined responses are effective enough to be acquired as part of the genetic equipment of the organism. Operant behavior, on the other hand, is largely concerned with the part of the environment in which the condition for effective action are quite unstable and where a genetic or instinctive endowment is much less probable, if not actually impossible. The genetic endowment. Reflex behavior is extended through respondent conditioning and apparently cannot be conditioned according to the operant pattern, which actually is not necessarily true if you look at Dom John. Glands and smooth muscles do not naturally produce the kinds of consequences involved in operant reinforcement, and when we arrange such consequences experimentally, operant conditioning does not take place. We may reinforce a man with food whenever he turns red, but we cannot in this way condition him to blush voluntarily. The behavior of blushing, like that of blanching or secreting tears, saliva, sweat, and so on, cannot be brought directly under the control of operant reinforcement. If some technique could be worked out to achieve this result, it would be possible to train a child to control his emotions as readily as he controls the positions of his hands. A result which resembles the voluntary control of glands or smooth muscles is achieved when operant behavior creates appropriate stimuli. If it is not possible to alter the rate of the pulse directly through operant reinforcement, other behavior, violent exercise for example, can generate a condition in which the pulse rate changes. If we reinforce a certain critical rate, we may in fact inadvertently simply reinforce behavior which produces it. This effect appears to be the explanation of apparent exceptions to the rule. Cases have been reported in which a man could raise the hair on his arm voluntarily. Other subjects have been able to slow their pulse on command, but there is reasonable evidence for supposing that every case an intervening step occurs and that the response of the gland or smooth muscle itself is not an operant. Other examples in which an operant and reflex are chained together in this way will be described in Chapter 15. It is not so easy to determine whether we can condition purely reflex responses in striped muscles through operant reinforcement. The difficulty is that an operant response may arise which simply imitates the reflex. One may sneeze, for example, not only because of the pepper, but because of the special social consequences. He only does it to annoy, because he knows it teases. Whether the facsimile sneeze resembles the reflex response in every particular is hard to say, but it probably does not. In any case, the controlling variables are sufficiently different to warrant distinction. The little boy who sneezes to annoy is unmasked when we set up conditions for incompatible operant behavior. If we offer him candy and the sneezing stops, we may be pretty sure that it is not a reflex. We need to say that the sneezing must have been voluntary, because he could stop it when he wanted to. A more acceptable translation reads, he stopped sneezing when variables were introduced which strengthened competing behavior. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior is further complicated by the fact that the two muscular systems sometimes overlap. The sphincters of the eliminative system and the muscles of the eyelid take part in certain well-known reflexes. I mean, I don't know about you, but you can't read the word sphincter and not chuckle. In the young child, the reflex control sometimes acts alone, but operant behavior is later acquired, which may become powerful enough to oppose reflex action. Ordinarily, breathing is reflex, but we voluntarily stop breathing under suitable conditions of operant reinforcement. For example, to win a bet or to escape the aversive stimulation of water in the nose when we dive. How long we stop will depend on the strength of the breathing reflexes, which become more and more powerful as carbon dioxide accumulates in the blood. Even more powerful as carbon dioxide accumulates in the blood, eventually a point is reached at which we cannot help breathing. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior bears upon our changing concept of personal responsibility. We do not hold people responsible for their reflexes. For example, for coughing in church. We hold them responsible for their operant behavior, for example, for whispering in church or remaining in church while coughing. But there are variables which are responsible for whispering as well as for coughing, and these may be just as inexorable. When we recognize this, we are likely to drop the notion of responsibility altogether, and with it the doctrine of free will as an intercausal agent. This may make a great difference in our practice. The doctrine of personal responsibility is associated with certain techniques of controlling behavior, techniques which generate a sense of responsibility or point out an obligation to society. These techniques are relatively ill-adapted to their purpose. Those who suffer are the first to speak out for the inevitability of their behavior. The alcoholic insists that he can't help drinking, and the victim of a bad temper that he can't help kicking the cat or speaking his mind. We have every reason to agree, but we can improve our understanding of human behavior and generally strengthen our control by designing alternative practices which recognize the importance of reinforcement as well as other variables of which behavior is a function. Discriminative repertoires. We have seen that any unit of operant behavior is to a certain extent artificial. Behavior is the coherent continuous activity of an integral organism. Although it may be analyzed into parts for theoretical and practical purposes, we need to recognize its continuous nature in order to solve certain common problems. Discriminative behavior offers many examples in the behavior of reaching toward and touching a spot in the visual field. Each position which the spot may occupy requires a particular combination of reaching and touching movements. Each position becomes a distinguishing property of a discriminative stimulus, which raises the probability of the appropriate response. Eventually, a spot in any position evokes the movement which achieves contact with it. At the very edges of the field, the behavior may be defective, and unusual cases may need special conditioning. For example, reaching for an object seen in a mirror, or from an unusual posture. But in the central area, all positions of the spot comprise a continuous field, and all possible combinations of movement leading to contact form a corresponding field. The behavior is acquired upon specific occasions when specific responses toward specific locations are reinforced, but the organism almost inevitably acquires a coherent repertoire which can be described without referring to the punctate origins of the two fields. If we wish to specify the smallest possible unit of correspondence between stimulus and response, we use the dimensions in which the two fields are described. The correspondence is between points, but in many repertoires, the minimal units fall considerably short of points in continuous fields. The stimuli and responses may not compose fields. When we learn the names of a large number of people, we do not expect either the visual patterns which the people present or their names to form continuous fields. The repertoire remains a collection of discrete units, even when stimuli and responses can be described as fields. The behavior may not be developed at that point. In several of the discriminative repertoires now to be considered, the functional unit is much smaller than the stimulus or response which appears upon a given occasion and with which we characteristically deal. But it is by no means always so small as to be expressed as an instance of the correspondence between fields. Drawing from copy. Our behavior in response to the spatial field in which we live is so familiar that we are likely to forget how it is acquired. There are certain less familiar forms of behavior in which the origin of a discriminative repertoire can sometimes be clearly traced. In drawing from copy, or less obviously from an object, our behavior is the product of a set of three-term contingencies. A given line in the material to be copied is the occasion upon which certain movements with pencil and paper produce a similar line. All such lines and all such movements comprise fields, but the behavior may not reach a condition in which it can be dealt with as a field. It is easily seen in the behavior of the young child learning to draw. A small number of standardized responses are evoked by the highly complex stimulus field. The behavior of the skilled copyist is composed of a much larger number of responses and may seem as natural as our responses to spatial positions. It does not reach the point at which it comprises a continuous field if a given line in the copy is not reproduced exactly, but rather with a characteristic response in the individual style of the artist. An extreme case in which behavior is divided into clearly identifiable discrete units, even though the stimulus has the characteristics of a field, is the behavior of the electrical engineer who draws a picture of a radio set using perhaps 20 or 30 unit responses. There are great individual differences in the ability to draw from copy. The contingencies responsible for the behavior are by no means so universal as those responsible for spatial behavior with respect to the visual field, and very different amounts of instruction are to be received by different individuals. Moreover, a small difference in early instruction makes a big difference in the eventual result. The child who develops at an early age a repertoire with which he successfully copies drawings and objects is likely to continue to use it and to receive further differential reinforcement. The special training of the artist includes many highly sensitive differential contingencies supplied by a teacher or automatically by the artist himself. as he becomes discriminating. A man who cannot draw well is likely to be puzzled by one who can. He cannot see how it is done. By no effort of will can he produce a comparable achievement. The basic minimal repertoire is simply lacking. It can be established only through discriminative reinforcement. The behavior is under the control of the copy, none of the artist, and until the copy has been put into control through differential reinforcement based upon it is a discriminative stimulus, the behavior will not occur. That is the most long-winded way to say practice makes perfect than I've ever heard in my life. Singing or playing by ear. Drawing from a copy is like responding to the spatial world, insofar as both stimuli and responses approach continuous fields in the same way in both cases. Or really, if you put your mind to it, you can learn anything. In playing an instrument or singing a tune by ear, however, spatial dimensions are lacking. Here, appropriate repertoires are set up by similar three-term contingencies. A tone is the occasion upon which certain complex behavior in the vocal apparatus will be reinforced by generating a matching tone. The reinforcement is either automatic, depending upon previous conditioning of the singer with respect to good matches, or supplied by someone, an instructor, for example, whose behavior also reflects goodness of match. Such a repertoire may also include responses to intervals. Each heard interval being the occasion upon which a complex response generating a corresponding interval is reinforced. Melodies, harmonic progressions, and so on may form the basis for similar repertoires. The same kind of relationships may govern the playing of a musical instrument, where the topography of the behavior which generates the tones or patterns is entirely different. The ultimate unit in singing or playing by ear may stop at the level of the half-tone scale. Both stimuli and responses usually show this grain. A singer with poor pitch is one whose response system has a poorly defined grain, which does not match the stimulus system. On the other hand, a singer with good pitch may correctly sing a melody which is itself defective. Here the response repertoire is in better focus than the stimulus. The half-tone scale is not, of course, a natural limit. The successful vocal mimic has a repertoire which approaches a continuous field and which permits him to duplicate non-musical sounds. The successful imitation of a bird, song, or of the noise of machines requires this sort of fine-grained repertoire. We easily lose sight of the conditioning required to develop such behavior. The individual who cannot mimic an auditory pattern or who cannot sing or play by ear is likely to be puzzled by the one who can. He finds it quite impossible to sing a matching pitch or to hum a corresponding tune or to imitate the noise of a locomotive, and he has no conception of how the successful mimic does so. He cannot be successful mimic by any act of will. The difference lies in the histories of reinforcement. The repertoire which one reproduces a melody has never been established. It will not be brought into play by the appropriate circumstances. Imitation. It is only a short step from these discriminative repertoires to the field of imitation. So far as we know, imitative behavior does not arise because of any inherent reflex mechanism. Such a mechanism would require that the stimulus generated by a given pattern of behavior in another organism elicit a series of responses having the same pattern. For example, the visual stimulus of a running dog would elicit running in another dog. This would be an extremely complex mechanism, and in spite of a strong belief to the contrary, it seems not to exist. Imitation develops in the history of the individual as the result of discriminative reinforcements showing our same three-term contingency. The visual stimulation of someone waving a hand is the occasion upon which waving a hand will probably receive reinforcement. The auditory stimulus, dada, is the occasion upon which the complicated verbal response which produces a matching auditory pattern is reinforced by the delighted parent, or dada. We see this sort of conditioning taking place in everyday life, and we can also set it up in the laboratory. For example, we can condition a pigeon to execute any one of several acts according to whether another pigeon is executing that particular act. When the imitatee is pecking a key in a certain position, the imitator pecks a corresponding key. When the imitatee pecks a key in a different position, the imitator behaves accordingly. When the imitatee moves to the opposite side of the cage, the imitator follows. Such imitative behavior occurs only when a specific discriminative reinforcement has taken place. Pigeons do not appear to imitate each other naturally. The necessary three-term contingency often occurs in nature. However, thus, if a pigeon is searching If a pigeon is scratching in a leaf-strewn field, this is an occasion upon which another pigeon is likely to be reinforced for similar behavior. The human parallel is not far distant. When we see people looking into a shop window, we are likely to look too, not because there is an instinct of imitation, but because windows into which other people are looking are likely to reinforce such behavior. So well developed is imitative behavior of the average person that it is of origins are forgotten, and it is easily accepted as an inherent part of his behavior. Imitative repertoires are often developed in relatively discrete sets of responses. In learning to dance, a set of more or less stereotyped responses is acquired by virtue of which a step executed by the instructor is duplicated by the pupil. The good dancer possesses a large imitative repertoire of dance steps. When this repertoire is faulty, the imitation is poor, and the novice finds it very difficult to match the complicated step. In dancing, as in singing by ear, the imitative ability of a good performer seems almost magical to the untutored. A good actor possesses an imitative repertoire of attitudes, postures, and facial expressions which enable him to follow the suggestions of a director or to duplicate behavior observed in everyday life. The attempts of the unskilled actor may be ludicrously wide of the mark because the essential repertoire is lacking. Although imitative responses approach a continuous field, that condition is probably never reached. The duplication of the stimulus is often not precise, and the grain of the repertoire with which even the good mimic duplicates behavior may be apparent. The similarity of stimulus and response in imitation has no special function. We could easily establish behavior in which the imitator does exactly the opposite of the imitatee. Our second pigeon could be conditioned to peck always in a different position. Something of this sort is involved in ballroom dancing, where the behavior of instructor and pupil in an imitative repertoire are not the same. In ballroom dancing, a step backward on the part of the instructor is the occasion for a step forward on the part of the pupil. This kind of inverse imitation can become as smooth as behavior having the same properties, as the good follower shows. Other non-corresponding repertoires are found in the field of sport. The behavior of the tennis player is controlled in large measure by the behavior of his opponent, but the corresponding patterns are not imitative in the usual sense. There is nevertheless a three-term contingency: subtle stimuli from the behavior of the opponent, which are correlated with a forthcoming placement of the ball, are the occasion for appropriate defensive behavior. The good tennis player becomes extremely sensitive to this kind of stimulation, and it is only because of this that he is able to get into proper defensive position. Fencing offers an especially good example of the integrated behavior of two individuals in which a response on the part of one constitutes a discriminative stimulus for a different response on the part of the other. The behavior may be as closely integrated as that of two dancers executing the same steps at the same time. These inverse imitative repertoires cannot approach continuous fields from which new instances will automatically emerge. To some extent, skilled dancers may improvise a dance in which one introduces a series of steps and the other follows, just as a tennis player is to some extent automatically in possession of the proper reply to a new offensive maneuver, but the corresponding fields which provide for the duplication of behavior in true imitation are lacking. Attention. The control exerted by a discriminative stimulus is traditionally dealt with under the heading of attention. This concept reverses the direction of action by suggesting not that a stimulus controls the behavior of an observer, but the observer attends to the stimulus and thereby controls it. Nevertheless, we sometimes recognize that the object catches or holds the attention of the observer. What we usually mean in such a case is that the observer continues to look at the object. An animated billboard is dangerous, for example, if it holds the attention of a motorist too long. The behavior of the motorist in attending to the sign is simply the behavior of looking at it rather than at the road ahead of him. The behavior involves conditioning, and in particular the special conditioning of the discriminative operant. The variables are not always obvious, but they can usually be detected. The fact that people read billboards instead of looking at the surrounding countryside shows how effectively reading is usually reinforced, not only by billboards, but by stories, novels, letters, and so on. Powerful reinforcements are arranged by thousands of writers in every field of the written or printed word. All of these stimuli have, except for you, bro. All of these stimuli have written common topographical properties which induce reading of new material. Some reinforcement may also occur on the spot if particular material is interesting. We saw in Chapter 6 that taking an interest is only another way of expressing the consequences of an operant reinforcer. We may study the relation We may study this relation in a simple experiment. We arrange to reinforce a pigeon when it pecks a key, but only when a small light above the key is flickering. The pigeon forms a discrimination in which it responds to the key when the light flickers and not otherwise. We also note that the pigeon begins to watch the light. We might say that this attending to it, or that it holds its attention. The behavior is easily explained in terms of conditioned reinforcement. That's some of your EAB for you, folks. That's why EAB matters. Looking toward the light, occasionally reinforced by seeing the light flicker. The behavior is comparable to looking for an object. Chapter 5. A steady orientation of the eyes is not the only possible result. The behavior of lookout in the dark or in the heavy fog is an example of looking with orientation to the whole visual field. The behavior of searching the field or responding to every part of it in some exploratory pattern is the behavior which is most often reinforced by the discovery of the important objects, hence it becomes strong. We can usually observe that the behavior with which a child looks for a misplaced toy is specifically conditioned. If some patterns of looking are reinforced by the discovery of objects more often than others, they emerge as a standard behavior. We may study this in the pigeon experiment by arranging a series of lights, any one of which may begin to flicker as a discriminative stimulus. The pigeon comes to look at all the spots in a more or less random order. It may be said to be looking for the flickering spot, as in the example discussed in Chapter 5. If the light begins to flicker while the pigeon is looking elsewhere, the flicker is seen at one side of the visual field. The behavior of looking directly toward the light is then optimally reinforced. We say that the light captures the undivided attention of the bird. But attention is more than looking at something or looking at a class of things in succession. As everyone knows, we may look at the center of a page while attending to details at the edges. Attempts to account for this in terms of incipient eye movements have failed. And in any case, no comparable orientation appears to occur in attending to features of an auditory pattern. Thus, when we listen to a phonograph recording of a symphony while attending particularly to the clarinets, it is apparently not possible to demonstrate any special orientation of the ear. But if attention is not a form of behavior, it does not follow that it is. Therefore, outside the field of behavior, attention is a controlling relation, the relation between a response and a discriminative stimulus. When someone is paying attention, he is under special control of a stimulus. We direct the relation most readily when receptors are conspicuously oriented, but this is not essential. An organism is attending to a detail of a stimulus, whether or not its receptors are oriented to produce the most clear-cut reception, if its behavior is predominantly under the control of that detail. When our subject describes an object at the edge of the page, even though we are sure he is not looking at it, or when he tells us that the clarinets have fallen a beat behind the violins, we need not demonstrate any special arrangements of stimulus and response. It is not enough to point to the special controlling relation which makes such a response possible. Similarly, in our experiment, we cannot say that the pigeon is attending to the light, even though it is not looking at it, if it consistently makes the correct discriminative reaction. If it strikes the key when the light is flickering and does not strike it when the light is still, it probably look at the light because the contingency responsible for attention is also responsible for the reinforcement of such behavior, but it need not do so. When we enjoin someone to pay particular attention to a feature of the environment, our injunction is itself a discriminative stimulus, which supplements the stimulus mentioned in controlling the behavior of the observer. The observer is conditioned to look at or listen to a particular stimulus when he is told to pay attention to it because under such conditions he is reinforced for doing so. People generally say, "Watch that man," only when that man is up to something interesting. They generally say, "Listen to the conversation in the seat in the back of you," only when something interesting is being said. Just as we may attend to an object without looking at it, so may we look at an object without attending to it. We need not looking through stuff. I'm feeling that way right now. We need not conclude that we must then be looking with an inferior sort of behavior in which the eyes are not correctly used. The criterion is whether the stimulus is exerting any effect upon our behavior. When we stare at someone without noticing him, listening to a speech without attending to what is said, or read a page absent-mindedly, we are simply failing to engage in some of the behavior which is normally under the control of such stimuli. Temporal relations between stimulus response and reinforcement. Goodness gracious. The environment is so constructed that certain things tend to happen together. The organism is so constructed that its behavior changes. When it comes into contact with such an environment, there are three principal cases. Certain events, like the color and taste of ripe fruit, tend to occur together. Respondent conditioning is the corresponding effect upon behavior. Certain activities of the organism affect certain changes in the environment. Operant conditioning is the corresponding effect upon behavior. Certain events are the occasions upon which certain actions affect certain changes in the environment. Operant discrimination is the corresponding effect upon behavior. As a result of these processes, the organism which finds itself in a novel environment eventually comes to behave in an efficient way. The result could not be achieved by inherited mechanisms because the environment is not sufficiently constant from one generation to another. This is variability. It is also characteristic of the normal environment that events occur together in certain temporal relations. A stimulus may precede another stimulus by a given interval, as when lightning precedes thunder. A response may produce a consequence only after a given interval, as when the ingestion of alcohol is followed by typical effects after a certain delay. A response may achieve its consequence when executed at a given time after the appearance of a discriminative stimulus, as when a ball can be hit only by swinging it after it has come within reach and before it goes out of reach. The first two of these characteristics raise no special problem. The effect of an interval of time between the stimuli and respondent conditioning is easily stated. If we give food to an organism 10 seconds after a neutral stimulus has been presented, the process of conditioning follows essentially the usual pattern. The dog salivates to the previously neutral stimulus, but eventually a temporal discrimination is established, or contiguity. The dog does not salivate when the conditioned stimulus is first presented, but only after an interval has elapsed, which gradually approaches the interval after which the unconditioned stimulus usually appears. We may deal with the result simply by defining the conditioned stimulus as a given event plus the lapse of so many units of time. The introduction of an interval of time between response and reinforcer and operant conditioning is also of little interest here. The effectiveness of reinforcement is reduced, but the behavior is not otherwise greatly changed. When temporal properties are added to the three-term contingency of the discriminative operant, however, special effects follow a response, is sometimes reinforced only if it is made as rapidly as possible. After the appearance of a given stimulus, a contingency of this sort is responsible for the speed with which many people rush to answer the telephone. Picking up the telephone and saying hello is reinforced only if the response is made quickly. The runner responds to the starting gun in the same way for the same reason. In a typical reaction time experiment, a subject is instructed to lift a finger off the key as soon as a light appears or a tone is sounded, with the result that the behavior comes to occur as soon as possible. Although the instructions given the subject in the reaction time experiment or to the runner starting a race are complex, the effect upon temporal specification. The same contingency will cause a pigeon to behave as quickly as possible also. The pigeon's reaction time is of approximately the same magnitude as man's. A response may also be reinforced only if it is delayed by a given interval of time after presentation of the stimulus. Thus, a pigeon is reinforced for pecking a key only if it waits, say, 6 seconds after the key is presented. Many social and commercial reinforcements are of this sort, where, for example, the net effect is reduced if one replies too quickly or agrees too readily to an arrangement, or where the unoptimal reinforcement follows only after due deliberation. Under contingencies of this sort, the maximal probability of response is characteristically reached a little before the required interval has elapsed. The characteristic effect of a delay is sometimes referred to as expectancy or anticipation. Let us suppose that a frequent visitor makes it a practice to give a child a bit of candy a few minutes after arrival. How can we formulate the behavior of the child in anticipating the gift of candy? We may note, first of all, that the arrival of the visitor serves as a conditioned stimulus, and that the child's mouth will possibly water. If the interval which elapses between arrival and the presentation of candy is fairly uniform, a temporal discrimination may develop so that this conditioned response will not appear until the interval has almost elapsed. If certain movements on the part of the visitor have usually preceded the presentation of candy, any movement on the part of the visitor will be reinforcing. The child will therefore attend to the visitor, and as the term has just been defined, he will watch the visitor closely. If any verbal stimuli have been especially correlated with the candy, he will also listen to whatever the visitor is saying, since listening will have been reinforced by such stimuli. Any behavior on the part of the child which has made the appearance of candy more probable has also been reinforced and will be as strong. The child may make himself conspicuous by showing off. For example, for the same reason, he may refer to former gifts and thus supply a hint to the visitor. Much of the child's behavior will be emotional. It is easier to observe this when the anticipated stimulus is aversive, as we shall see in Chapter 11. The emotional state in such a case is called anxiety. When the anticipated stimulus is positively reinforcing, there's a general change in the behavior of the child in the direction of greater excitement and responsiveness. There are, to some extent, the strengthening aspects of joy or delight. We shall see in Chapter 10 that these terms must be used with caution. There is still another ingredient in anticipation. The behavior of the runner in response to words, get ready, get set, shows all the effects so far listed. 1. Conditioned reflexes involving pulse, respiration, and sweating, and so on. 2. A special controlling relation to the voice of the starter, which we call close attention. 3. Emotional changes, which, if the race is to be grueling one, will be more characteristic of anxiety than joy. In addition to all this, the runner tenses his muscles and adopts just that posture, which will make his response to the signal go most effective. This kind of behavior, sometimes called preparatory set, is reinforced by the increased speed of the response which follows. The behavior may be nothing more than a partial execution of the response of going, sometimes revealed in the false start, or it may consist of any other form of behavior which receives the net reinforcement of a more successful start. For example, holding still rather than rocking back and forth on one's toes. Chapter 7 in the books. All right. Whew. We're getting through it. Almost through Section 2. This is the brutal part. Section 3 is the fun part. All right. You guys be cool. Be marvelous.